thank you so very much, and welcome everyone to this Friday's presentation. We have a great panel with us. Gwen is here, Holdmann, with the director of the Alaska Center for Power and Energy. She spoke to our group in February about more innovative energy systems and other solutions. We're thrilled to have her back to speak more specifically about small-scale nuclear energy. And also with her is Richelle. She's with the University of Alaska Center of Economic Development, and she's going to review the market feasibility and market development considerations for any small-scale nuclear here in Alaska. And Isaac does not need much of an introduction. He's the director of Launch Alaska, a fellow board member of Commonwealth North, and I think he's going to talk about Launch's role as a business accelerator, innovator, and kind of further the discussion related to small-scale nuclear in our state. Gwen, welcome back, and please unmute and start us off. And then I understand you'll be tossing it to Richelle and Isaac. So welcome, and we look forward to getting started.
Excellent. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity to come back and speak again. This is always probably one of the funnest groups to present in front of, because there's so many people that are so knowledgeable about many of the issues that we're talking about and deeply interested. And so I actually really enjoy the kinds of conversations that we have as part of this group. For those of you, I'm just gonna maybe switch the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, I'll just give like a really brief overview of that. We're relatively young, about 10 years old, applied energy research and testing program based at UAF, but really with very much a statewide focus and emphasis. We are mostly focused on reducing energy costs or developing new economic opportunities for Alaska communities, residents, and industries. And as part of our program, we collaborate pretty widely, both within and outside the university. We have about 50 researchers. We're primarily focused at UAF, but we have about a group of about 8 researchers that are located down in Anchorage, co-located with ICER, the Institute for Social and Economic Research. And I think this project is a really good example of other collaborations that we have around the university. It's been a real pleasure to work with Richelle and CED and the Business Enterprise Institute. And then outside the university, working with Launch Alaska, we have a lot of different partnerships there. So it's a real pleasure to be working with Richelle and Isaac in this space. A lot of our work, we've been working on micro-reactor technologies for a decade, just about as long as ASAP has been around. And initially, this was an area of interest, and it still is, of the state legislature. They asked us to put together an initial sort of pathfinding report in 2010 to look at the options for, at that time, what were small modular nuclear reactor technologies that could be deployed in Alaska. We've continued to track the technology over the last decade, and there's been just a real kind of renaissance around these small micro reactors, and that's really interesting to us as a research program. And so we've been working on, we recently redid our 2010 analysis, added a lot more to it. That's available on our website at ASAP. I think I included the link there and kind of circled where you can find the report, but I think Amanda Bird, who does a lot of our outreach, is going to drop that link in the chat as well. And if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can also sign up for our weekly newsletter, which is a really good way to stay in touch with all of the stuff that we're doing at ASAP. So we have a pretty broad research portfolio. But anyway, I'm going to just kind of move on here and just say, you know, for those of you that aren't that familiar with these terminology, there's a lot of different words that people use for these small nuclear reactor technologies. I've sort of focused on this word small because I think it kind of encompasses a lot of these different areas, whether they're modular or you know, different types of words that we're using. And I think that Richelle will probably pick up on a few of those as well. But basically, you know, what we're looking at, when the big difference that we're looking at is between small modular reactors and micro nuclear reactors. And the big difference between those is really related, and I'm actually going to switch to my next slide here. You can kind of see here, we talk about small reactors as being less than 300 megawatts of electric power output, and that sort of is the top of the graph here. This is a logarithmic scale. You can see those that are in sort of the top part of that graph are somewhere in that, you know, like 60 megawatt to, you know, pushing 300 megawatt range. And a lot of those are, some of those are standalone, but a lot of those are also modular. NuScale is probably the industry leader there and the one that we've heard the most about in Alaska, with the idea there that you have several different modules that are sort of grouped together into a single larger power plant. So the big difference then between those, which were sort of in development a decade ago, and these small ones down at the bottom, is really around sort of the energy output and the physical size, the amount of on-site construction that's going to be required, what the requirements might be for refueling during midlife, and then the timelines for that refueling, like how often that actually occurs. And so there's some real differences there, with the big one being that there is, these are really designed to be sort of factory designed and developed. They're small, they're portable, transportable, and designed really for remote applications. And so it's a really, there's a lot of evolution in this particular space right now. So I thought a little bit about like why I am interested in these small reactors. And I think this basically covers why a lot of people in Alaska are sort of interested in this technology space. Nuclear energy is interesting because it has the potential to provide baseload energy, not just electric power, but also heat. And so in a cold climate, that's actually pretty appealing. And I think is a real advantage of this technology over renewables in particular. It's carbon free. And then I have some question marks after these last bullets, right? So theoretically, they're safer. Theoretically, they are price competitive with alternatives or our status quo energy sources. Theoretically, we would have better long-term certainty about energy costs because we're not necessarily refueling these very often in the field. So we sort of know what the costs are associated with producing energy over time. Theoretically, there's a reduced risk of environment. And when I think about this, again, it's in relation to the status quo. When we look at like diesel-based power in rural Alaska, there's actually quite a lot of environmental contamination that happens just due to handling that fuel, moving that fuel, the tanks that hold that fuel. And so there is, we have to understand that there is environmental contamination there, and potentially that would eliminate some of that, especially in sensitive environments. And then I think it has a real potential to complement existing renewable energy resources, especially, you know, we have quite a diverse number of those in Alaska, and this has the ability to follow load and follow output from variable renewable resources, which is pretty exciting to me as an engineer. So I thought I'd lay out a couple of just kind of compelling questions for this group. Richelle and Isaac, this is a little bit of my thinking here that's evolved a little bit over time, but I thought I'd just lay these out. So these are a little bit rhetorical because I'll just answer them myself. But you know, what do microreactor technologies have in common with the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System? And a big one of those are these heat pipes that are used for cooling of the ground under the foundations, under the pilings for the permafrost. Those are a pretty cool passive way of transferring heat from the ground to the air in this particular case, and those use ammonia. A lot of these microreactor technologies are similarly using heat pipes, even though the temperature range is completely different, and sort of the different, you know, the mechanisms for moving that heat are totally different. But I think it's a really neat way of passively moving heat, and this is a big part of why these are presumably safer, because you have these passive features built in of how you're removing heat from the core, and either using that beneficially or just ensuring that you're not going to, you know, have some sort of a a challenge with regard to removing heat if something were to go wrong with the system. And so this is kind of interesting to me because you're not using pumps or valves. Heat pipes are cool because they're about as close to perpetual motion, I think, as you're going to get. And so I've always been intrigued by them. And, you know, in this case, they're actually using basically a liquid metal instead of like ammonia that's in that's being used in the TAPS heat pipes. So I just kind of want to point that out as like one of the safety features that's associated with that. And then there's a lot of other ones just specifically associated with the fuel and the way that that's configured. That's really has like these multiple steps around making sure that there's not the unintended release of nuclear material into the environment. I guess I left a slide in related to that, but I'm going to skip this. Another one, we were just watching a documentary last night, The Men Who Built America. I'm sure some of you have watched that. I was watching that with my kids, and we were talking about how the Ford assembly line was this really different way of manufacturing in America, and it really made a big difference in terms of quality control, in terms of the ability to increase throughput. And these micro reactors are really kind of designed around the similar sort of concept where it's like a factory designed and assembled system so that we have a lot more controls over that processing and a lot less on-site construction, thus reducing the cost and ideally, you know, or hopefully ensuring that there's really good quality control on the design of these systems. Yeah, so this is like a conceptual image from a NuScale power reactor building. And so you can kind of see these multiple sort of reactors that are built in a factory are kind of put in place here. For these sorts of modular reactor systems where you have a bunch of different modules, there's still quite a bit of on-site construction. You still have refueling after a couple of years. Micro reactors take that even one step further where you don't have any refueling in the field. The idea is that it comes as some sort of a containerized solution, potentially buried below grade or on grade, and the entire reactor module is returned to the manufacturer at the end of its life for refueling or repurposing, and that would be like closer to about 10 years or so. So this other question, like what do microreactors have in common with diesel generators, which are pretty ubiquitous, at least in rural Alaska communities? And the big one, and this is of interest to me as an engineer, is that they're capable of load following. And this is pretty different from legacy reactor technologies. Each of these features is different from legacy reactor technologies. You know, if we have something that can follow both the load that any community or any grid has, and also kind of follow the output of renewable energy to the extent that that might be available on that grid, that's a pretty exciting additional feature of these and different from legacy nuclear reactors, which tend to operate better at base load. And so this is another thing that a lot of the developers and manufacturers are working on that is exciting to me. So I just want to wrap up by saying that we're working on developing a small nuclear working group right now. And we really have some goals here to continue conversations like the ones that we're having today, educate Alaskans about the industry and what's going on at the national and international level, but also educate stakeholders from the national and international level that are in industries or agencies about Alaska and do that through the lens of potential future deployments in the state. And then the third bullet, which was sort of thought about by a larger group, is really thinking about opportunities to demonstrate a small reactor technology in Alaska in a way that minimizes risk and maximizes potential benefit to Alaskans. We are organizing the first working group meeting at 11:30 a.m. on May 18th. If you can join us, I think that we would invite any of you to sign up to join the working group or just put your name on that list. That first meeting, we're planning to have a general organizing meeting, and then we have a presentation scheduled by Westinghouse on eVinci, which is one of the leading microreactor companies in the US. So, and that's all I have. I'm going to pass it over to you, Richelle. I'm wondering, I haven't been following the chat, but let me stop sharing. And then I think, should we wait till the end for Q&A? Does that make sense?
Yeah, why don't we do that? Because I think it'll be easier. We could get caught up in Q&A for the next half hour easily.
Okay, then I'll take it away. Hello, everyone. I'm Richelle Johnson. I'm the lead analyst with the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development. To give everyone, an intro to our center, we're an economic development organization housed within the University of Alaska Business Enterprise Institute. And we specialize in entrepreneurship development, strategic planning, and market research in Alaska. And so the bit of work that I'll be sharing with you guys today fits within that market research bucket there. So I'm going to be briefly talking about CED's findings in a recently released series of reports on the market potential for microreactors in our state. This project was initially started in 2019 through an introduction from our friends at ASEP with the Idaho National Laboratories, and the work was conducted with support from the Department of Energy. And Idaho National Labs was interested mostly in understanding more about the Alaska energy market and the factors that might influence advanced reactor technology adoption in our state. And so kind of to hit some of those buzzwords that Gwen mentioned, we focused on those microreactors, small modular reactors that kind of meet the basic power needs of some of the energy systems in our state. One second, sorry. There we go. So to address this interest, we developed kind of a set of questions for our work around microreactors. The first was, what does the market for microreactors look like in Alaska? You know, who are the customer segments that could or would implement nuclear technology? What are their energy needs and limitations? And we did that with kind of a blend of qualitative and quantitative analysis, and we tried to, which means that we talked to a lot of energy operators and planners, stakeholders across the state to kind of get perspectives from the horse's mouth, more or less. The second question that we had was, what factors matter to energy planners and operators when they're making decisions about adopting new energy technology? And then thirdly, what factors matter specifically for nuclear? Do those match with the perspectives that energy operators, planners, and the people who are making decisions on what tech to implement, what they look at? What concerns specifically do they have about nuclear? What questions do they have for the industry and whatnot? And then lastly, kind of in the entrepreneurship world, we talk a lot about identifying a startup's first best customer. And part of our goal for this work was to identify what characteristics existed for that first best customer for nuclear in Alaska. To get a handle on kind of what would that first demonstration project look like, and what would that adopter need. So to frame this conversation, I usually go over a couple of quick facts about Alaska's energy market, but I think that that's probably old news for the folks on this call. So I'll use this slide to note that when we're talking about nuclear in Alaska, one thing that we really noticed when we were doing this work and continues to kind of come up in conversations is that there seems to be a kind of clear divide between the attractiveness of high costs of small scale system size and need for new energy technology in rural areas, and then the technical capacity, available capital, and support systems that exist for energy systems in urban Alaska. When we're talking about adopting very, very early stage technology, this is kind of an area of discomfort, I would say, that comes up very frequently in conversation. Rural areas really needing the benefits of emerging energy technologies, but being nervous about implementing something in a system that relies very heavily on small changes. So for this project, we talked to, as I said briefly earlier, energy producers and system operators, planners, and stakeholders from user groups across the state to get their perspectives on energy challenges, hear about their plans for the future, and get some of their thoughts on nuclears. These individuals came from some of the user segments that you see here on this slide. This was guided a little bit, mostly, well, not a little bit, mostly by available information. This is by no means comprehensive of the entire energy landscape in Alaska. As many of you already know, our energy operators and producers are incredibly diverse. And even within these kind of buckets that we formulated here, everyone has unique needs and system requirements. So what were our findings? We found that there's a lot of interest in micronuclear across the state. And the level of knowledge around small scale nuclear tech is pretty deep across most of the energy experts that we talked to, with a huge interest in learning more. I think a good example of this is that people across the state that we discussed the subject of nuclear with reference the work in Galena very frequently. Energy experts followed that work, even though it was a decade ago, and the project is still really fresh in their minds. And this interest in nuclear comes from a lot of different angles. First of all, it's well recognized as Gwen mentioned a little bit briefly, that renewables are pretty unlikely to fully replace diesel generation or carbon fuel generation because of their inability to consistently accommodate baseload generation. And that's a proven fact about renewables, is that they're available when the resource is available, and that may not necessarily always match when there is a demand for power. There's also a very widespread desire to reduce dependence on diesel fuel supply chains and the costs, logistics, and risks of fuel spills associated with it. Another point of interest that we found was that nuclear also targets energy producers' desires for easier maintenance and cost stabilization. There are a lot of variable costs associated with diesel generation across our rural communities. And maintenance and O&M is a constant challenge for many energy producers. It's also safe to say, as Gwen mentioned briefly, that heat production potential is on the back of the minds of many people when they're thinking about nuclear. A couple of the utilities that we discussed this with noted that it was potentially a new line of business if they could utilize the heat captured from the systems. But one of the biggest findings that we had, which probably isn't surprising, is that there are a lot of questions to accompany that interest. We heard everything from concerns over regulatory requirements and the burden and costs that may entail, to the realities of operations and maintenance and the unknowns that still exist amongst the nuclear developers. One of the big unanswered questions, which could make or break a potential project adopting nuclear technology, is cost. And because the technology is still so young and many developers are still in the testing stages, estimates on costs are still pretty blurry. We don't know much about what the reality will look like for that first adopter, or even the second or third adopter down the road. It's also worth noting that we did explore some public perception around this topic, but little to no public perception work around small-scale nuclear in Alaska has been done. We heard a lot of concerns from people across the state about local public perception issues, and whether or not that would impact a nuclear project. And so that kind of brings us to our underlying question about who would potentially be that first customer in Alaska for adopting nuclear. From our work, it's clear that first adopter could play a really important role in establishing confidence with the technology on a wider level. And energy experts in Alaska will probably be paying pretty close attention to any nuclear project that gets traction. And while there's a lot of pressure that comes with that scrutiny, it's a really good opportunity to share learnings from those first projects, and that could reduce barriers for adoption for others. So what are the characteristics that that first adopter will likely have? Regulatory and technical capacity to deal with uncertainty of new technology is pretty high up there, as well as high costs to make any project pencil out. But also cost resilience to handle unforeseen costs as the project kind of moves through its life cycle. And then also a certain level of risk tolerance and comfort implementing early stage untested technologies. As this small scale nuclear technology advances into the deployment stages, I think conversations like the ones that Gwen and her team are curating will be really important to hash out some of these fuzzy areas where energy operators in the state have questions about the technology and its logistics in Alaska. I also personally think that conversations like this are really important because they give Alaskans an opportunity to communicate to the nuclear industry what we need and what's important to us as some of these developers move further into the deployment stages. And to leave enough time for questions, I will hand things over to Isaac from there. Take it away, Isaac.
Hey, Richelle.
Yeah.
Well, before we go to Isaac, I'm going to go back on what I said and request your indulgence on one quick question from Harold Hines on market segments. So Harold, take it away.
Hi, I'm going to talk about something that you're going to think I'm absolutely crazy because I'm a very well-known oilie. And I was disappointed to see that the people you were not talking to was the hydrocarbon industry people in Alaska. And the reason for wanting to talk to them is that they are at the front end of a major sea change in carbon dioxide. And the industry taps, the North Slope production, refineries, blah, 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 even the electric power generation in this town are all geared towards converting hydrocarbons to CO2. And if all of a sudden you gotta stop doing that 10% a year for 5 years in a row, you better be prepared for a major change that they are not able to accommodate at this time. You might be a very interesting sort of fallback position that they might want to understand a little better. And I can't think of anybody better to be involved in your experimentation with power plants in harsh environments in Alaska than the very oil companies that are here and those kind of things. So that's my pitch.
That's a really good point, Harold. And I don't know if I have anything not worth, but of substance to say other than it would be fantastic to have those people engaged in conversations going forward in the working group that Gwen is setting up, because the goal is to capture as many perspectives as possible on that. And if that's someone that we're missing, they should be at the table.
All right, I'm taking it as that's my cue to start here.
That's your cue to start.
Thanks, Richelle, and thanks, Marianne, for the invite, as always. Hoping everyone can see my screen. Technology is working. Yeah, I think I was invited to this presentation because Launch Alaska has actually invested in one of the companies that Gwen and Richelle mentioned, a group called Oklo. And so even though the spotlight of today should stay on the great work that CED and ASEP have done with the studies that they released, I think I was invited just to kind of narrow the aperture here a little bit and look at it from an investment perspective and why we were excited about one specific company. So this is the shortest presentation that I'll ever give. It's a one-slide presentation called, Why Launch Alaska Loves Oklo. But hopefully my shots will, or my slides will illuminate some of our thinking, why we're excited about Oklo. So first and foremost, one of the things that we love about Oklo the most is the team, not just the people that they are and the human beings, but just their track record for performance. You may know that Oklo as a company has gone through the regulatory process with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission faster than any other application in history. So, 20 times faster to get their initial approvals than any other group has done, and at 1/1000th of the cost, which is a really exciting kind of game-changing business model that they've put together. And the team has just shown a real ability to perform, move quickly, raise additional rounds of funding. So just very, very impressed by the team themselves. The next thing that I think is really exciting about Oklo to us is that, while the fundamental technology that they are commercializing or that they're taking to market is proven and has been around really for decades, what's really innovative is their business model. Where Oklo owns the development, licensing, capital cost, as well as the, what Richelle talked about, the O&M, the operations of the powerhouses over the long term. And that's a business model innovation that is super exciting to us. And I think could be a game changer for them actually getting some long-term, contracts. This business model de-risks the project for the customer. Because they can simply go and sign a power purchase agreement with an IPP and buy electricity or heat once the reactor is online. There are other business models or ownership models that Oklo can provide, but just that core, acting as an IPP to sign PPAs with utilities is really exciting. And while the initial units, like any new technology, are probably a little bit more expensive, over time as they get to scale, those project economics should get better and better, and their costs should come down over time. We're also really excited that Oklo, the first privately funded nuclear company on the face of the planet. Usually these things are funded by large public institutions, and tend to have huge dollar amounts attached, and then do a good job of exceeding those dollar amounts, but by orders of magnitude. We love the fact that Oklo's entire path to market so far has been purely with private funding. Additionally, the Oklo's ability to think about tomorrow's problems. So if we are, as Harold was mentioning here or referring to, if we are trying to move quickly on decarbonizing our energy systems globally, there are technologies that we have that are ready today and that we're working hard to deploy, but we also need technologies that will get us that final 10 or 20% to full decarbonization. And Oklo is in a perfect position to kind of fill in that gap to get us all the way home to a fully decarbonized kind of global economy. And so, it's one of these technologies that's looking at, or one of these groups that's looking a teeny bit over the horizon. Yet having said that, they are ready to go today, and they are already starting to reach out to Alaska stakeholders and starting some really exciting conversations. In addition, just the size of Oklo is the right size for kind of remote islands or forward operating bases. And their first product, which I had a picture of there on that introductory slide, which is the Aurora Powerhouse, it ranges from 1 to 15 megawatt of electricity. And that product line is designed to provide always on electricity and heat with no carbon footprint. So it's a perfect fit, kind of referencing what Richelle was saying. It's a perfect fit for several users in Alaska, and a place for them to get some of their initial projects done. And then, you know, last but not least, just from a pure investor perspective, you know, it can be an easy decision to invest in a company like Oklo when some of the smartest investment funds in the world have already done it. So in that sense, we can be followers and, you know, follow smart money, and that is a reality. Like, you know, some of the people that are backing Oklo in their first rounds are some of the smartest folks out there. So that feels like good company. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Happy to answer additional questions. One last thing that I might throw out is that you know, people fret a lot about nuclear waste and the waste problem around you know, any kind of nuclear technology. The interesting thing about Oklo that gets me really excited is that if you think about it, because the feedstock that they use for their plants is basically you know, nuclear waste, that if they, you know, are able to accomplish their vision and they're able to get past, you know, serial number 1 to 10, but get into the hundreds or thousands of units deployed at some point, the waste problem that our country has gets better and better with each additional unit. And so it's one of these, you know, there's of course several steps between now and then, but they are in a great position to also help solve that problem that we inevitably will have to grapple with, which is what to do with this long-term nuclear waste. All right, that's all I've got. Thank you.
Okay, all right, well, this is Juanetta. We'll go to questions and answers now for our panelists. And as always, we kind of like to throw it to our co-chairs to see if they have any initial questions. I do have some questions in chat, but Marianne or Bernie, did you have any questions you wanted to throw out to the panel at this point?
Sure, I'll start it off, if it's okay. First off, back in 2010, we had a state statute that didn't allow any nuclear plants to be involved in our state. Has that been removed? I cannot remember it being actually taken off the statute.
I could go ahead and take that because that was one of the issues that we addressed in our report. And the answer is, Bernie, it wasn't quite that simple. It wasn't that there wasn't that we couldn't install a nuclear power project, but that it had to be legislatively approved. And that's sort of, I think that's sort of the piece that I think that there's been interest from, especially developers like Oklo, and saying, hey, that creates like a political overlay. Like, I mean, we obviously want to have regulatory agencies have a lot of input, and local communities and local governments, but to say that the state legislature needs to approve each of these projects on a one-by-one basis is really something that was really designed for a bit of a different era when we were concerned about proliferation and things like that. So, so we've put together a list in our report. You can review that. It's actually in an appendix that that is a comprehensive review of the state statutes and all of the places that we recommend changes to those statutes based on modern reactor technologies versus like what we were concerned about, you know, back in at that particular period of time. I know that the legislature did introduce a bill in a the Senate Commerce committee, I think last year, and that's also kind of discussed in our report. I don't remember the name of the bill, but I think they ran out of time to move that forward. I think that's something that just still needs to be done. It should, we need some language sort of cleaned up at the state level to make sure that we're not creating undue barriers to projects in the future. That is not really what the intention of that language even initially was. So.
Okay, yeah, I kind of vaguely remember that, but I didn't know if anything has progressed on it. And the second question I have is the tax subsidized for nuclear power that's floating around in DC right now for probably going to be tied into the infrastructure bill. And have you been talking to Lisa or our delegation at all about having, I know Lisa Mikowski has always been real interested and a big supporter of nuclear power, but where does that stand? Do you have any information on that right now? And they're talking about giving it the same subsidized for that wind and solar have for the percentage of energy that they generate. So I was just wondering if you had any input on that.
I guess I can just start, and Richelle and Isaac, you might have some different information. Bernie, I haven't been tracking like the details of some of that. I do know that at the national level, and certainly Senator Murkowski has been extremely supportive of these micro-reactor and modular reactor technologies. There's been a lot of different government programs that have offered subsidies, including, you know, various tax breaks or, you know, different strategies for that. I know there's a lot of interest at the national level. The Department of Energy has a pretty extensive, you know, Office of Nuclear Energy that is very much tracking the evolution of these technologies. I don't know about that bill specifically, and I have not been in any sort of contact with our legislative offices in DC, but I do have a fair degree of confidence that both of our senators are tracking this as a potential opportunity for Alaska and have at least some knowledge of what might make sense up here.
Thank you.
Richelle, did you have something you wanted to add?
I'll just add in, I'm probably in a similar boat to Gwen, that I am aware of the work that the Department of Energy and that Senator Murkowski has put into advocating for advanced nuclear technology. I don't know anything about subsidies in the current infrastructure bill. I will note that another policy point of interest is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is undergoing a review of their rules and procedures to potentially make some adjustments to how they regulate micro reactors as opposed to the very large scale reactors, traditional reactors. That part of the reasoning behind that, as I understand, is that because of the size and scale and just technical characteristics of the technology that we're talking about, it doesn't necessarily need a lot of the oversight that the NRC places on traditional reactors. So that's something that is also moving its way through the statutes and regulations as well.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, we have a question from Tom Turner. Of course, we know that larger scale nuclear is deployed in countries like France and China, but are there working examples of where small scale nuclear have been deployed?
It depends on how you want to define small scale, but I'll tell you one that I didn't mention in this version of my presentation. Is that, you know, the countries that are really leading this technology space other than the US are China and Russia. And, you know, Russia's taken a slightly different approach to these sort of micro reactor technologies. What they've been doing is they've been using many of these reactors that were really designed for various marine applications, and they're using those for shore-based power. And so, like, they have, for example, a system that they installed about a year ago, I think in Prevec in northern Russia, that produces about 30 megawatts, basically barge-mounted nuclear reactor that they're using to provide power to the community there. And that's one of the strategies that they're sort of using. It's different in that it is really sort of a more conventional, you know, more kind of naval reactor design that they're applying to these sort of onshore and more civilian applications. But, you know, there are plenty of examples of small nuclear projects that have occurred in other markets. In fact, our own industry in the US, the first reactors that were developed were small, relatively small reactor technologies. We've gotten to these gigawatt reactors because of economies of scale and a cost and long period of time that it takes to actually, you know, build a reactor in this modern era. And so, so this is something that there are plenty of small reactors that are out there, but this micro reactor technology is a slightly different thing. Again, there's military examples, space, there's a lot of different kinds of applications that we're looking at for this, but there haven't been any that have been deployed in the US or the Canadian market, which has been a primary focus, I think, of our analysis.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Gwen. Just as a follow-up, you've referenced Department of Defense. Lou Florence is online with us, and he's referencing remarks from Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Environment and Energy Resilience, Richard Kidd, who said that DoD is going hard on small modular reactors. Specific in reference to Richelle's comments, how will DoD maybe be an anchor tenant or user of small scale nuclear? Do you want to reference that?
Yes. I have heard Lou say in the past that DOION is not currently pursuing nuclear. But I have heard of conversations from Eielson actively pursuing some of the DoD programs for the first deployments. Gwen probably has more information on that than I, because I think ASAP has been involved in a lot of those conversations, if I'm correct.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, from a university standpoint, we're trying to be careful to, not necessarily be advocating for nuclear energy, but providing information for stakeholders to make good decisions about these technologies. And, I do know that DoD has a very significant interest in these different technology options, both for bases and for forward operating potentially operations. Another thing that is maybe that would be of interest to this group is this program called Project Pele, which is about developing a portable nuclear reactor that's kind of moving forward through the Pentagon. They've down selected to 2 companies. One is BWXT Advanced Technologies and X Energy, which are looking at developing or deploying a 1 to 5 megawatt output reactor within just the next few years. And there's been consideration as to whether an Alaska base might be one of the locations under consideration for testing or deployment of one of these really small transportable nuclear reactors. So this is actually even a little bit different than what we've been focusing on today. Transportable reactors, really like a truck mounted system that's really designed for sort of a temporary deployment potentially, or longer term too. So there's a lot going on in this space.
All right. Thank you, Gwen. And Richelle, Mary Ann has a question for you.
Yes, I just wanted to say, given the global issues of carbon and having both Gwen and her incredible expertise in innovative energy solutions, and the team from Launch and Isaac that always seems to be at the forefront on finding solutions, this is an incredible opportunity for Alaska. Isaac, can you talk a little bit about some of those very smart investors that are interested in this? Because I'm curious, is it the big oil companies or is it somebody else? I'd like to know.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I would leave it up to Oklo to share if they want to who's on their cap table, but it's not big institutional investors. It's VC funds. So we're talking venture capital style investing, folks who are looking to do direct equity investing into the early rounds on Oklo's on their cap table. And that to me is really exciting because it's entirely private folks who are trying to help Oklo grow as quickly as possible, and that's a totally different funding model for nuclear than has ever existed before. Yeah, that's what I was referring to.
Okay, fantastic.
All right, well, I'm going to call on the audience for last questions. Again, okay, we've got one from David Lockhart here. When you've done the economic analysis on small scale nuclear, have you assumed capacity factors based on load following, so for example, 20 or 30% of rated output, or based on existing large nuclear reactors, 90 to 95%? So I think that's a Gwen question.
Okay, David. No, I mean, David makes a really good case here. The economics are actually pretty squishy right now still. And I think that that is actually the place where we would really like to do a little bit more work, because you make a very good point there that if we're taking advantage of this load following capability, right, then we're not operating that, that reactor at full output levels, and we're still paying for the same amount of infrastructure, fuel, you know, those kinds of things. And so that changes the economics, right? So that's one piece of it. The other one is really trying to quantify the heat portion of this. Like, are we using heat coming directly from the reactor, or are we generating power and then using heat that's coming out of the back end of that power cycle, which is essentially like a waste product, quote unquote, right? And so there's a lot of different questions that really significantly impact the economics of all of this. And especially because, you know, we have this sort of this system, this transmission grid and energy infrastructure in Alaska that's based around these microgrids, right? So to the extent that we have interconnected systems like on the rail belt, that's a slightly different part of the equation, because you might be able to provide more baseload output and maybe maximize your economic equation with a system. But if we're looking at something like, for example, a rural hub community or something like that, and again, I'm not thinking this in 5 years, but I think that, you know, in Alaska, we do need to be thinking about what are our options, you know, 10, 20, 30 years out into the future, and what are the questions that we need to be asking that may or may not get us to some different sort of paradigm or different future. Those kinds of questions are pretty important, and they really impact the economics of these systems. I think that the developers often try, and we've worked with Oklo quite a lot, Isaac, because this is exactly the kind of thing that we think it's pretty important to give honest answers to the manufacturers and developers, and not sort of understate the actual real world scenarios in Alaska. And so those are really good questions. And if the Alaska Energy Authority would be interested in working with us and funding some more additional economic analyses, we would love that.
Yeah, and I would just add that certainly Oklo is laser focused on, you know, the economic modeling around their units and how they fit in real world applications. I also think it's a good reason why kind of, you know, DoD or remote resource sites are good first users, because you can focus more on making sure the technology is safe and the technology works and get people comfortable with its operations. But then when you start looking and thinking about PPAs with actual utilities in the state, it's all driven by economics. And so I can tell you, yeah, the company is very focused on making sure that they can come in under the wholesale price, you know, for instance.
Okay, well, thank you. We have a question from Owen Phillips, and I think when you've addressed this a little bit, but you know what, obviously there's going to be a lot of developmental hurdles to get past to see the first unit online, but what kind of time frame would we anticipate to see one of these projects break ground here in Alaska?
Yeah, I should have actually maybe addressed that. I apologize, and thank you for bringing that up. You know, I mean, the reality is that we are not talking about a technology that Lou or somebody else is going to be able to make decisions around anytime in the near future. You know, there's still a lot of unknowns. To some extent, this is the technology, one of those technologies that's always, you know, 5 years off, right? But I think that we're getting closer and closer to some real test deployments. The expectation is that larger modular reactor system like NuScale will be deploying in about the 2030 time scale in terms of a pilot project, probably at Idaho National Lab. But it's actually expected, and Isaac kind of really highlighted this, that the trajectory for development of these micro reactor technologies like Oklo and others is actually going to be quite a bit faster, because they are smaller. And even though there's a lot of novelty around some of the permitting and licensing pieces of this, in a lot of ways, that technology itself is actually simpler to deploy, you know. And so the expectation is that these will be deployed and tested. They're both in the US and in Canada, which has a pretty advanced strategy around micro reactor and small modular reactor technologies, in about the next 5 years. But really, realistically, like in terms of commercial availability, I can't envision that being any earlier than really a decade out, other than, you know, what we're talking about, like pilot projects like Project Pele, which very well could happen in Alaska in the next, you know, two years or so.
Interesting.
Totally
And-
agree. I would also just offer up that if there are communities or off-takers in the state who are interested in this technology and thinking, you know, even in an early way that they might be interested in talking to Oklo. I know that Oklo is ready and willing to think about going after some site license applications, and starting to have conversations with folks in Alaska. So it's still years away, to Gwen's point, but conversations with Oklo are ready to be had, and they're interested in connecting with folks. So reach out if you have any notion that this could be intriguing to you.
And actually, sorry, Vanetta, I'll just add on to that. Like, I think this is an excellent reason to join the working group and have those conversations, because Oklo has definitely been an early engager in Alaska, and I think it's really awesome that they are participating with Launch Alaska. But I think that there are a number of different manufacturers that are quite interested in learning more about Alaska and have interest in potentially deploying here in the state. We're trying to be technology agnostic about that. Isaac has his favorite in the horse race, which is totally appropriate and fun. But there are other vendors that are looking at Alaska. And so I think that that's why we need to have a working group to really make sure they have good answers to questions, that we have good answers to questions that we have, and that they also have the information they need to really be thinking about what would be appropriate for a potential deployment in this state.
You know, that brings up two quick questions. One for Isaac, which is during Oklo's time here with Launch Alaska, was there any particular findings that they had in terms of adjusting their model, their business model, or thinking about operations in Alaska, that they adjusted their profile?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the learnings that they had pretty quickly was that, those figuring out who the first users should be. It's I think the kind of DoD or remote resource is probably the best for all sorts of reasons. And so that was a great kind of learning that they had. I think also just meeting with some of the great engineers in the state and folks at utilities, understanding, what the different load profiles are, and also what some of the, the unique environmental factors of Alaska around things like, foundation and permafrost and logistics. Like, that was a great education for them. And to their credit, they've most of the folks on this call have probably met someone from Oklo at some point. They really have gotten out there and just done a lot of interviewing and refining of their business model and their kind of path to market. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the wood chipper units that got deployed, and they kept blowing out their, I can't remember what that particular unit was, but just because of the moisture level in the chips in Alaska. And so, yeah, I imagine with these small scale nuclear reactors, seismic activity is something that's probably of interest to them as well. So, and then Gwen, just along those lines, I guess, what are the sort of, what is the temperature of the regulatory environment in Alaska? I mean, we've heard some of the questions regarding, potential exclusion or the need to have legislative approval on a unit. But when it goes downline from there, what is the capacity of the utilities, or particularly since we have so many small scale utilities that would be the likely clients for this, for bringing one of these units online, and do they have the capacity to integrate it without some sort of adaptation on their part?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, Juanetta. I kind of heard you ask two things. Like, one is sort of on that regulatory piece, like what is really the capacity of, or the knowledge that Alaska regulatory groups like DEC have to potentially address the concerns related to a micro reactor. And that's actually one of the things that we're hoping to do a bit with this working group, is the opportunity to sort of do some what ifing, like think through potential prospective scenarios and get permitting agencies engaged in that conversation so that we can ensure that they sort of have some of the knowledge or comfort that would benefit them from, you know, potentially needing to work in this space and not necessarily being fully prepared to do so, right? And then secondly, in terms of like the communities and utilities in the state, you're right. You know, a lot of them are very small. A lot of them serve maybe a single community. I don't really think that really small communities right now are something that makes any sense to be thinking about in any sort of a near-term time frame. I do know that some of our larger hub communities a lot of our utilities are quite interested in this technology space from all around Alaska. And so, you know, really trying to help them navigate this, this new landscape and understand what's happening at the national level and how that might fit in with them is pretty interesting. But a lot of these micro reactors are also thinking about pretty innovative, these companies are thinking about innovative business models, like, for example, serving as an independent power producer and just selling power to a utility. So it wouldn't necessarily be the utility that is completely on the hook, you know, for all the complexities associated with a technology like that. So innovative business models, which is more of Isaac's wheelhouse, is something that's I think a big piece of this.
Great, good. Well, we moved a little past 1 o'clock, and I see folks are starting to drop off, but it's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks to all three of you for sharing the work that you're doing in this space. It's interesting to see it. I maybe Richelle, did you mention the Galena project? I can't remember.
Very briefly, yes.
Okay, yeah. I just remember years ago when that came up and everybody was like, what, a nuclear reactor in an Alaska village? That seems like a big stretch, but obviously the technology has come a long way, and as has the thinking and the creativity around deploying something like this. So it's very interesting to consider what the future might look like with these small scale nuclear reactors for Alaska energy. All right, just a reminder to everybody online that we will post the slide decks and the session recording. You'll receive an email about that. It'll also be posted on the study group webpage at commonwealthnorth.org. There's lots of information and links that have been shared in the chat. So I do want to encourage you to look at that before you take off some of the reports that have been referenced, as well as the sign up form for the working group that Gwen has referenced a couple of times. So all good information. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. Marianne had to leave for another appointment, so I'll do the sign off, and thank you again for joining us. And thanks most especially to Gwen Holdmann with Alaska Center for Energy and Power, Richelle Johnson with the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development, and Isaac Vanderburg with Launch Alaska and the Commonwealth North Board of Directors. So thanks to you all. Friday, everybody.
Bye. Happy Friday.
Take care.